Evolutionary Theory, Section 3. In this section we're going to go beyond Darwinian theory. We'll start with a bell ringer. We'll talk about the key ideas. In this section we'll look at Darwin's theory and how it's been updated. We'll talk about studying evolution on all scales, and then we'll summarize. So your bell ringer. There's much controversy about the theory of evolution. Why is it so controversial? And what are your thoughts regarding evolution? Our key ideas for this lesson. How has Darwin's theory been updated? And at what scales can evolution be studied? Darwin's theory updated. There's been a number of discoveries since Darwin's time that have led to the expansion of evolution. One such discovery is that in the study of genetics. So Darwin's theory has been modified from new information that's been added, but for the most part his theory has been supported. The first major advance beyond Darwin's ideas was from Mendel's laws of heredity in the early 1900s. By the 1940s, scientists began to weave Darwin's theory together with newer studies of fossils, anatomy, genetics, and a number of other sciences. The unification that occurred with all of those sciences is currently called the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. Biologists have learned that evolution can result from processes other than natural selection. Survival and reproduction can be limited by chance or by the way that genes work. In the current view, any or all of these forces may combine with natural selection, as was described by Darwin. So remember, natural selection is that process where nature changes. Based on changes in nature, it allows certain organisms to be better suited to the environment in which they live. Therefore, those organisms pass on their trait to the next generation. The combination between the environment, natural selection, chance, it helps to explain some of the patterns of evolution that were unexplained just by natural selection. There are some remaining questions about Darwin's theory. So modern biologists have some tentative answers to those questions. And so I'd like to take a little bit of time to look at each one of those. So the first one is, can an individual evolve? Darwin correctly inferred that individuals do not evolve. Individuals respond to outside forces. We call that adaptation. But individuals do not pass on their responses as heritable traits. So just because you walk outside and put a coat on doesn't mean that your children are always going to walk outside and put a coat on. Rather, populations evolve when natural selection acts indirectly on genes. So when a natural environment changes and certain organisms are better suited to survive in that environment, the gene frequencies or the allele frequencies within a population slowly change over time. Is evolution the survival of the fittest? And this is kind of an interesting question. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow as we look at a comic regarding survival of the sneakiest. So natural selection can act only on the heritable variation that exists in a population. So there can only be the genes that are available within a population that are expressed. Chance variations do not always provide the best adaptation for a given time and place. So evolution does not always produce the fittest forms, just those that fit well enough to leave offspring. So those organisms that fit in the environment best to be able to reproduce, the traits that are exhibited within those organisms are more likely to be passed on to the offspring. Is evolution predictable? And I guess the short answer of that is, really it's not. Evolution sometimes results in larger, more complex forms of life, so the theory goes. But this result cannot be predicted. There are many life forms on the planet that are extremely simple, and yet they are successful. So scientists cannot predict the exact path that evolution will take. And we're going to talk a little bit about two forms of evolution. And one of them we will find is definitely measurable. And the other one, it's a lot more difficult for us to actually see it occur in nature, if at all, if it's actually happening. So studying evolution on all scales. So because evolution affects all aspects of biology, we tend to study it at many levels and on many scales. There are two major scales that we're going to look at. We're going to talk about microevolution, and we're going to talk about macroevolution. Speciation would be the process that happens between the two. We're going to see how microevolution does occur. How microevolution is definitely measurable within a population. And we're going to look at how macroevolution, we're not exactly sure if that is occurring. So microevolution refers to evolution as a change in the genes of a population. So we can see and we can measure gene changes or gene frequencies within a population. We're going to actually do that on Friday. Whereas macroevolution refers to the appearance of new species over time. So in this picture, the one on the left would represent macroevolution. New species arising from other species. We cannot measure that or see it. On the right, that would be an example of microevolution. All of the organisms we see on the right are dogs and in the same family. Gene frequencies between these different species can be shared. A wolf can interbreed with a domestic dog. A coyote can interbreed with a wolf, and so on and so forth. And the alleles that occur that code for the certain traits of each of these different species can be shared. So the process of microevolution. To study microevolution, we look at the processes by which inherited traits change over time in a population. There are 5 major processes that affect the kinds of genes that will exist in a population from generation to generation. Those 5 processes are natural selection, migration, mate choice, mutation, and genetic drift. So natural selection can cause an increase or decrease in certain alleles in a population. So this is a perfect example of that. In this case, we've got a species of pig that anytime it has a dominant allele, it ends up with, or it has 2 dominant alleles, it ends up with very, very thick fur. If it has a dominant and recessive, an intermediate form occurs. If it has 2 dominant or 2 recessive alleles, then it ends up with very short fur. All of these organisms in this population put those alleles into the entire gene pool. And the frequency with which those genes occur in offspring depends on who is better able to survive in an environment. So an increase or decrease in alleles can occur within a population based on the environment. So the first process of microevolution is migration. Migration is the movement of individuals into, out of, or between populations. Migration can change the number and the types of alleles within a population. The second process of microevolution is mate choice. So if parents are paired up randomly in a population, a random assortment of traits will be passed on to the next generation. However, if parents are limited or selective in their mate choice, a limited set of traits will be passed on. Many organisms are selective in their mate choice. Humans are selective in their mate choice. There are certain characteristics that are more desirable than other ones. And so because of that, mate choice causes populations to change over time. Mutation is another process of microevolution. Mutation can change the numbers and the types of alleles from one generation to the next. It's important to remember, though, that these changes are extremely rare. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is due to the random effects of everyday life. So, for example, this picture represents this. Just random chance that a whole bunch of bugs are running around, cockroaches are running around in your house. Well, what do? You squish them. Genetic drift is the randomness that occurs based on you squishing them. So it might just be that you walk around with a fly swatter and you start swatting all of them that you see. So the random effects of everyday life can cause differences in the survival and reproduction of individuals. Because of these differences, some alleles may become more or less common in a population. So you're walking around smacking all of the cockroaches and killing them. You're not being very particular about which ones you're killing, you're just killing them all. That's genetic drift. Genetic drift is just due to the random effects of everyday life. Their population is going to change based on what you did. Patterns of macroevolution. To study macroevolution, we look at the patterns in which new species evolve. And this is extremely controversial because even though we can see microevolution, we can see it at work, macroevolution we cannot see. And we cannot measure macroevolution. We can predict it, we can guess at it, but we cannot see organisms evolve. It has not ever happened, and it probably will never happen. So we study the direction, diversity, or speed of change. Patterns of change are seen when relationships between living and fossil species are modeled. So we look for what does a fossil species look like, and how is it similar or different from species that live today. And so scientists make predictions based on what they see in the fossil record. Coevolution. Coevolution is an idea where organisms, because they're part of each other's environments, they affect one another's change. So for example, this picture represents this. If the flower gets longer and longer and longer, in order for the hummingbird to get the nectar inside of the flower, it has to have structures that allow it to reach all the way in. So the beak has to get longer and longer and longer with each successive generation. That would be coevolution. One changes, therefore it causes a change to another one. So species that live in close contact often have clear adaptations to one another's existence. Adaptive radiation is a lot of what Darwin talked about. So over time, species may split into two or more lines of descendants or lineages. As this splitting repeats, one species can give rise to many new species. And this is what Darwin really thought occurred. He thought that one species slowly descended to other ones based on the fact that they were better able to survive in an environment. The process tends to speed up when a new species enters an environment that contains fewer other species. Extinction plays into this as well. If all of the members of a lineage die, or simply fail to reproduce, the lineage is said to be extinct. So the fossil record shows many different organisms that have become extinct. Only a few of their descendants survived, and this macroevolution theory states that they may have changed into present-day species. We cannot prove that. We can only speculate. Gradualism. Darwin thought that organisms changed slowly over time. That is this example of gradualism. So there was gradual change from one species into the next. Darwin had argued that large-scale changes, such as the formation of new species, must require many small changes to build up gradually over a long period of time. And this is the model of gradualism. Slow variations over long periods of time lead to the diversity that we see now.
The gradual evolution of a population over time is called gradualism. If two parts of an interbreeding population are isolated from one another, the environment, food source, or predator of one or both groups may slowly change. Sometimes the change in a group's environment is enough to slowly cause a change in the species itself. The two groups may continue to slowly change until they are unable to breed and produce fertile offspring with one another. At this point, speciation has occurred. Gradual speciation is the idea that new species evolve gradually at a stable rate from a single ancestral population.
The next pattern of macroevolution is called punctuated equilibrium. Some biologists argue that species do not always change gradually. They believe that certain environmental factors may cause a species to change very quickly. That is this process of punctuated equilibrium, where one species changes extremely quickly due to new pressures within the environment. So we end up with many new species that suddenly appear. So instead of a gradual change over time, punctuated equilibrium states that real quick changes would occur within a population, causing new species to arrive.
Scientists use two models to attempt to explain the formation of new species. In the gradualist model of speciation, species evolve more and more over time at a stable rate. In the punctuated equilibrium model of speciation, species arise abruptly and are quite different from the original species. The resulting species then change little over time. Fossil evidence suggests that rapid speciation is not uncommon, particularly when harsh environmental factors such as increased levels of volcanic eruptions, ice ages, or significant meteor impacts radically change the environment, forcing organisms to either change or become extinct.
So in summary, discoveries since Darwin's time, especially in genetics, have been added to his theory to explain the evolution of species. Because it affects every aspect of biology, scientists can study evolution on many scales. Generally, these scales range from microevolution to macroevolution, with speciation in between. It's important to remember that microevolution we can see. Microevolution does occur. Macroevolution is more of a theory. It is speculated. We aren't exactly sure how that entire process works, or even if it does occur.